It was no joke. On April 1st, 1901, Jay Vivian Chambers was born in Philadelphia on a cold, early morning with snow blanketing the ground. A blizzard was soon to come. Weighing 12 pounds and measuring 12 inches across the shoulders, his birth nearly killed his mother, Laha. An artery was torn and baby Jay had to be removed with instruments. It was sad but fitting that Jay was born in this fashion, difficult and dangerous. His birth would serve as a type of foreboding for the remainder of his life. He was an abnormally large newborn, and he'd grow to live an abnormally large life. Young Jay was named after his father, Jay Chambers. His middle name, Vivian, was the last name of one of his mother's lifelong friends. As a child and young adult, he despised his first and middle names and vowed to change them as soon as he was able. While he didn't know it at the time, he would live to have multiple first and last names, most of them assigned to him. Eventually, though, Jay would take his mother's maiden name for his first and keep his father's surname, going by who the world now knows him as, Whittaker Chambers. Young Whittaker grew up in Lynbrook, New York State. His family moved there in 1904, just after Whittaker's little brother Richard was born. As Whittaker became a child and began to understand and compare his world with that of others, he became keenly aware of the dysfunction that he was continually surrounded by. Both of his parents, Jay and Laha, came from the world of art, as they were both thespians in their young life. They loved the stage and continued to act even after having their two boys. More so Jay. He was truly an artist and viewed himself as much. He didn't care for the comforts of a middle-class family. This was made apparent by withholding any money for his wife to beautify or just to repair their humble home. Nor did he pay any attention to his son's overall health. Both Richard and Whittaker often suffered toothaches to no relief from a dentist. As Jay submerged himself into his work as an artist for the local paper and took a liking for the opera and all things culture, he became completely absent from the family. He would come home in the middle hours of the night, almost always drunk. For this and many other reasons, young Whittaker regrettably, but honestly, lacked any respect for his father. Jay's absence and lack of engagement made Laha become Whittaker's favorite parent, even if it was by default. Their shared sentiments regarding Jay drew them into a close relationship, but Laha struggled with her own demons. She became dependent upon her young boys and could be described as acting somewhat neurotic at times. For some reason, she felt the need to frequently remind Whittaker of how much pain his delivery had caused her. Understandably, he grew to resent this. Yet despite all of her faults and problems, Laha loved her two boys and they became her life and her world. And the small family even tried attending an Episcopalian church for a time. But without reason, the boys were suspected of passing the whooping cough to one attendant. That ended their 3-month trial. As such, religion played no part in their home. Whittaker might not have needed religious education, but he would need all the hope and grounding that he could get because the tenuous marriage of his parents rapidly dissolved when Whittaker and Richard were still young. Jay had his own life outside his family and simply solidified this by moving out. He would send the family $8 a week, which at the time Laha and her two boys managed fairly well. But Whittaker knew that they were poor, and he would understand later that Jay could have given more in alimony, seeing that he had a steady and relatively good-paying job. The good part of Whittaker's father being gone was that their home became a much happier place. His father's absence at home lightened the usually oppressive atmosphere. But it wasn't long before Jay had moved out that Grandma Whittaker would move in, and she was anything but a calming presence in their house. With early dementia, Grandma Whittaker would lock herself into her room and light little fires cooking something. The family learned to disregard her incessant self-ramblings as well as the smell of smoke coming from her room. There were several times when Whittaker, being the largest in the family, would have to intervene, whether it was breaking down a door to see what was aflame or wresting scissors or knives from her clenched fists. Grandma being at the house, in addition to the old tensions, was like having a demonic presence sitting in the heart of their home. Whittaker would later write, "I suppose nobody ever sleeps quite peacefully in a house where a woman sometimes wanders around with a knife." While Whittaker seemed to take the brunt of all this abnormality, the weight was surely shared by both brothers. Living under the same roof caused Whittaker and Richard to become very close, even though they were growing up to be quite different men. Richard was good with his hands and worked with them often. He ended up building a guest house on their property, which he would soon move into as a young adult. He was more outspoken, expressed more emotion, and soon became Laha's favorite sons, as it was natural for him to confide in her, something that she desperately craved. Yet as he neared his late teenage years, Richard began to find solace from his pitiful life in drinking more prohibition whiskey than he clearly ought. By the time he was 20, he could be found drunk in the early hours of the day. Whittaker, on the other hand, was more cerebral, immersing himself into books and self-reflection, guarding and keeping his thoughts almost entirely to himself. In the fall of 1920, Whittaker enrolled at Columbia College. Upon attending, he took the opportunity to finally rid himself of the name Vivian to officially take his mother's maiden name, Whittaker. And although he was already abreast of the communist movement, it was here that he began reading more of its happenings and was encouraged by others to delve deeper into the social, economic, and political world of Marxism. Here, Whittaker's skills and talent with writing, reading, and translating the languages was noticed among his peers and professors. Many thought that he would become a novelist or a major poet. Indeed, Whittaker did write. Among his works was a short play entitled A Play for Puppets. It was featured in Columbia's literary magazine. But the atheistic nature of the playlet caused controversy among the school and even spread to the New York City newspaper. Whittaker was disheartened and came to dislike Columbia. Although it wasn't his first choice of colleges, it allowed him to live at home and save the family from paying boarding fees. Choosing to live at home rather than live at a dorm not only saved the family money, but in a sense saved the family, or what was left of it, if only for a short time. In the 2 years that Whittaker attended college, Richard found himself further down the road of self-destruction, continual drinking with self-absorbed unhappiness. One night at a bar with his friends and brother, Richard became so belligerent he began cursing for all to hear, himself and his parents for ruining not only their lives, but his life as well. The sober Whittaker took offense at the remarks and, with the bartender's approval, threw a tumbler of whiskey at Richard's face. The two brothers fought in the bar and throughout the night. Whittaker, although larger but not as scrappy, finally went to bed bleeding from the bridge of his nose. The scar that Richard left him would remain with Whittaker for the remainder of his life. It was a sort of going away gift, as Richard was soon to leave. Within a year's time, Richard would take his life. He was found in his kitchen one morning with his head resting on a pillow inside the gas oven, his feet propped up on a pile of books with a bottle of whiskey just below his rigid fingers. Whittaker, although in shock from seeing his brother and his best friend cold and lifeless, was not surprised. Richard had tried this multiple times before without success, only because of his older brother's intervention. It was only a matter of time. Not long after Whittaker removed his brother from his house and had him buried, did he receive a call from Laha informing him that his father Jay had passed away. His mother said that Jay had simply dropped dead in the bathroom as he prepared to shave. Whittaker was 22 years old, and his small world, as broken and fragile as it was, had mostly died. And what was left was dying. His mother was withering away from grief, and his grandmother was clinically insane. Whittaker was convinced that the death surrounding him and the many pains that preceded it was just a microcosm of the world at large. World War I had just ended 3 years before, claiming 22 million lives. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was nearing its end, having murdered tens of millions and served as communism's catalyst to spread across the globe. Revolutions were happening, as were epidemics. The Spanish flu was in full swing and would kill 50 million people before it ended, not to mention smallpox that would end up taking many more than that. Much of what Whittaker intimately knew was poverty, neglect, alcoholism, and dysfunction. And at the time, the world seemed to reflect that stark reality. Yes, the world was dying of its own vulgarity, stupidity, complacency, inhumanity, power, and materialism, a death of the spirit. That this world was dying, both brothers knew, but they differed on how to face the fact. Richard had simply removed himself from what he found unsolvable or unworthy to be solved. He had made his choice, and so would Whittaker. But whereas Richard succumbed to the world's cancer of wars, economic crises, and moral enervation, finding nothing to live for, Whittaker committed to become the cure, having found something to die for. By the time his brother and father expired, Whittaker was already a member in the Communist Party. But now he became an unreconcilable communist in both body and spirit. Not because he was simply attracted to it, but was driven to it from despair by the crisis of history through which the world was passing. Whittaker was at a loss, and he felt helpless. God was not in control of his circumstances, nor his brothers. God wasn't in control of the wars and the revolutions, nor the epidemics of diseases spreading across the globe. If God could not or would not solve the problems plaguing mankind, then mankind had no choice but to assume the throne. Whittaker would write that communism restores to man his sovereignty by the simple method of denying God. But although Whittaker was about to plunge deep and long into a worldview that not only denies God but seeks to eradicate any trace of him, God would not deny Whittaker. Rather, God would pursue him. Whittaker was now in his early 50s and was now a counter-revolutionist testifying against communism. What had at once given him a reason to live had now become evil and now actually risked taking his life. Whittaker, in the midst of deadly consequences from without and emotional turmoil from within, was presently shining an unwanted light on not only his past affairs working for the Soviet secret military intelligence, but many others who were still working within the United States government. After 25 years, Whittaker would look back on his time as a communist. In those beginning years soon after Richard's suicide, Whittaker's ability with writing and editing were quickly put to use for the Communist Party, specifically class angling. This was the art of rewriting news stories with a communist interpretation. That was just the beginning, though. Whittaker's proficiency and devotion to communism exceeded simply working for the party and being shuffled around to and from various socialist presses, producing pamphlets, magazines, and any other forms of literary propaganda. He had more services to offer, and others lying in wait had taken notice. And within a short time, Chambers was recruited to join the communist underground. Accepting it as his solemn duty, Whittaker was now a spy working to overthrow the U.S. government on behalf of Stalin's Soviet Union and the Military Intelligence Agency, the GRU. After serving under various controllers, taking assorted identities, holding numerous job titles, and only living in places for short periods, Whittaker finally came under the direction of Harold Ware, a member of the Washington spy apparatus. Ware was an agricultural engineer and was employed by the Federal New Deal, while covertly leading a group of about 75 operatives within the U.S. government. It was in this place and in this time that Chambers became close to Alger Hiss. Hiss was a fellow communist spy, and like Ware, he also served within the higher echelons of the Washington establishment. He was a government attorney, served in the New Deal, the Justice Department, and would later even serve in the U.S. delegation to attend the famous Yalta Conference, where Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill met to negotiate the terms for the end of the war. Circumstances had Whittaker and Alger in close contact, living together for a short time. Their families shared a rare type of intimacy, that kind that could only be relegated to secrecy and truly understood by the life of a spy. From the plenty of people that came in and out of Whittaker's life within his service as a Russian asset, Chambers would later confess that Mr. Hiss had become his closest friend. By now, Whittaker was in the thick of his espionage activity, but his concerns with taking orders from the Soviet Union were growing. At first, he was specifically disillusioned with Stalin's personal perversion by turning to fascism. But shortly after that, Whittaker came to see that it wasn't Stalin he was concerned with, but communism itself. He would later write, quote, "The point was not that Stalin is evil, but that communism is more evil, and that acting through his person it found its supremely logical manifestation. The important point was not the character of Stalin, but the character of communism." End quote. Through Whittaker's marriage to his wife Esther in the early 30s and the births of their 2 children afterwards, both events which were unofficially frowned upon by the party, God was slowly but steadily convicting Whittaker not only of the evils of communism, but the joy and the grace that could only be had in a life surrendered to himself. God was calling Whittaker to come forth. And it wasn't until 1937 until he first began to feel like Lazarus, a man making the impossible return, climbing from the deep underground into the realm of the living. And within a year's time, in April of 1938, Whittaker and his wife made that final decision. The only possible choice, that they had rather die than live under communism. It would be all sorts of hell that they would have to endure. Whittaker faced the threat of physical death for defecting from anybody at any time, but it was the emotional turmoil that he suffered that was just as troubling. In times of weakness and unbearable stress, it was as if Whittaker's brother was calling from the ground to join him. But through all the pain and all the trials, nothing made the couple regret their decision. Chambers finally and officially broke with communism and took his wife and 2 children into hiding. But Whittaker didn't break from communism just to remain quiet. but to eventually fight against it. In April of 1939, almost 1 year exactly from leaving the Soviet underground, did Whittaker finally come out of hiding to go to work for Time. His actions against communism were going to be slow and methodical, and his new job allowed for those two maneuvers. He began at Time as a nobody, a third-string book reviewer making an annual $5,000, and he quickly rose to senior editor, making $30,000. Never once did he ask for a raise. As a well-trained former communist, Whittaker never really knew or cared how much money he made. Nearly 10 years later, he resigned as one of the best-known writer-editors from Time because the court case that he was in had reached a crisis. Looking back, Whittaker would write, "My debt and my gratitude to Time cannot be measured. At a critical moment, Time gave me back my life. It gave me my voice. It gave me sanctuary, professional respect, peace, and time in which to mature my changed view of the world and man's destiny and mine in it. I went to Time a fugitive. I left a citizen. In my years with it, I became a Quaker and took my wife and children with me into the spiritual peace of the meeting." And Whittaker would need a reservoir of peace for the long battle ahead. Soon after leaving Time, on August 3, 1948, Chambers was called to testify before the House on the Un-American Activities Committee. It was here where he gave witness to the names to all those he knew inside the underground Ware group. This undoubtedly included his once good friend Alger Hiss. It caused Whittaker, the disheveled and portly witness, much anguish to have to testify against him. His statements didn't accuse Alger of espionage activity, but straightly claimed that he was, or at least had been, a member of the Communist Party. But the buttoned-up and good-looking Hiss flatly rejected any allegations that he had ever been a communist and claimed no knowledge as to who Chambers was. The long trials that pursued would be called the Hiss trials. These were some of Whittaker's worst years of defection. By now, he was thankful to not really worry about being snuffed out by an unknown assassin, and he remained grateful for his work at Time, where he gained respect and a bit of editorial notoriety. But coming before the United States government to confess his past and having to charge others, specifically his close friend Alger, of secret allegiance to Soviet Russia, bore down on his body and his soul. In the beginning, the majority of people just couldn't believe that the U.S. government had been infiltrated to such an extent. And on the surface, Hiss was likable, believable, and had a near-finished education and career. Whittaker, on the other hand, looked tired and depressed, and his accusations too far-fetched. President Truman straightforwardly dismissed Whittaker's testimony as a red herring. He surely didn't like the allegation that the man responsible for the United Nations Charter Conference was a communist. But Whittaker simply knew too many intimate details about Alger that couldn't be easily ignored. Yet, without evidence, the first trial ended in 1949 with the jury deadlocked. Meanwhile, Hiss's attorneys referred to Whittaker as an enemy of the Republic, a blasphemer of Christ, and a disbeliever in God. This was ironic to say the least, since it was due to Whittaker's hope to save the Republic and his new trust in God that he was testifying. Regardless, the defense also put up a psychiatrist who pointed out Chambers' childhood, characterizing him as a sort of psychopath whose only nature was to lie. But the evidence finally produced by Chambers in the second trial was undeniable. Under subpoena, Whittaker presented 4 handwritten notes composed by Hiss, 65 State Department documents, and 4 strips of microfilm that had once been hidden inside a hollowed-out pumpkin. These papers and microfilm became known as the Pumpkin Papers. The reason for the delay in producing the evidence was, by Whittaker's account, to spare an old friend from more trouble than necessary. But even though Whittaker tried to guard his old friend, the evidence was not as gracious. And eventually, in 1950, when the second trial had reached its conclusion, Hiss was found guilty on 2 counts of perjury, being sentenced to 5 years in prison. He couldn't be charged with espionage because the statute of limitations for such a crime was only 5 years. The whole ordeal was unpleasant, to say the least. The international attention, the constant personal attacks, and the character assassination left Whittaker troubled, saddened, and took a brutal toll on his overall health. He had been suffering from heart problems for over 10 years now. But although the court case was conclusively over and the smoke had settled, Whittaker had much more to say, unencumbered by interruptions from attorneys and groans from the crowds. He would do what he knew best. He would write his account, his life story, why and how he became a communist and why he defected. He would explain everything in vivid detail in his 800-page autobiography aptly entitled Witness. In 1952, Chambers published his work to widespread acclaim. The book was a bestseller for nearly a year, which helped pay some of the legal debts that had been growing. But as an ex-communist and now a Quaker, money meant little to Whittaker, whereas honesty and honor meant everything. His autobiography served to make the record straight. It laid to rest any suggestion that he had fabricated anything in his testimony. But Witness wasn't just written as a counter-revolutionist's hope to win over his enemies, but as a father, gently explaining his complex life to his 2 children, who were too young to understand all the drama swirling around them and their father. As such, Whittaker bore his soul for all to see, that communism and freedom were the 2 irreconcilable faiths of his time. To Whittaker, a witness against communism was a witness for God. And that calling to witness in every sense of the word became Whittaker's cross to bear. He would explain this to his son and daughter in the introduction of his autobiography. My children, when you were little, we used to sometimes go for walks in our pine woods. In the open fields, you would run along by yourselves. But you used to instinctively give me your hands as we entered those woods where it was darker, lonelier, and in the stillness our voices sounded loud and frightening. In this book I am again giving you my hands. I am leading you, not through cool pine woods, but up and up a narrow defile between bare and steep rocks from which, in shadow, things uncoil and slither away. It will be dark, but in the end, if I had led you aright, you will make out 3 crosses, from 2 of which hang thieves. I will have brought you to Golgotha, the place of skulls. This is the meaning of the journey. Before you understand, I may not be there. My hands maybe have slipped from yours. It will not matter. For when you understand what you see, you will no longer be children. You will know that life is pain, that each of us hangs always upon the cross of himself. And when you know that this is true of every man, woman, and child on earth, you will be wise. 9 years after, on July 9th, 1961, Whittaker died of a heart attack at his 300-acre farm in Westminster, Maryland. Having said his piece, he left his wife and children the life he had always wanted, and a witness the world could never ignore. So that's a very short summary of the life of Whittaker Chambers. And my reason for this podcast is that we, first and foremost, that we wouldn't ignore or forget Whittaker's witness. And thankfully, some haven't ignored Whittaker's influence. 23 years after his death in 1984, President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded Chambers the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contribution to the century's epic struggle between freedom and totalitarianism. In 1988, Whittaker's house and farm was granted National Landmark status. And in 2001, under the administration of George Bush, a private ceremony was held to remember the 100th anniversary of Chambers' birth. And just recently, in September 2020, after the destruction of many American monuments by rioters, some of which were communist, 2 Maryland state senators from Carroll County announced their intention to recommend a Whittaker Chambers memorial under Donald Trump's executive order to build and rebuild monuments to American heroes. But the effort was essentially turned down by members of Whittaker's family. They wrote, "Whittaker Chambers sought a simple life of farming the Pipe Creek. He was a Quaker. His beliefs ran toward austerity and self-effacement. Quaker meeting houses stand unadorned, without monuments or statues. He would not have liked such fanfare. The best way to remember our grandfather is to read his books. Rather than a monument, he left testimony to read." And as I've stated before, Witness is one of my favorite books, and I encourage you to read it because there's so much to glean from it. There's way too much to consider in this podcast, so we'll have to narrow our focus just to 1 or 2 points today. But later on, we'll do a whole podcast on what exactly communism is, or what's the difference between atheism and militaristic atheism. And there's a lot of other subjects in which we find in Whittaker's Witness, but we'll do that at a later date. But if I had to encapsulate the life of Whittaker Chambers into one overarching meaning, it might be something like this. We see in Whittaker 2 men with opposing views, one living in the first half of his life and the other in the second. And both wanted to change the world, but those visions of the world were completely incompatible or even hostile to each other. In the first half of Whittaker's life, we see a young and thoughtful and gifted man who came from a troubled childhood. He was idealistic, he was intellectually passionate, and he wanted change for the better. As he wrote in his autobiography, many people who become communists do so for moral reasons. But he wanted to change the world, but that new world was one without God. One world that was opposed to freedom and one that denied the soul of man. Whittaker plainly wrote that the communist vision is the vision of man without God. It was the world that John Lennon sang about. There's no heaven above us. There's no hell beneath us. Above us only sky. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. And no religion too. But whereas Lennon believed that it would lead to peace, history informs that godlessness leads to war and to genocide. The communist vision is the vision of man without God. That's what Whittaker wrote. And thus, a world without religion. This was the world that Whittaker supported, which has to be a very difficult place to be in, because man is created in the very image of God. That man, above all other animals and beings, somehow man bears the reflection of God. And one cannot easily deny that part of themselves that makes them distinctly human. It has to be a hard thing to do. It's like snuffing out the divine spark of what it means to be human. Whether it be personally or philosophically or theoretically, when the mark of God upon us is suppressed, it can only be done to one's own harm and subsequently the harm of others nearby. So in Whittaker's communist view of the world that denied God, it also denied something deep within the heart of man. If all people are created and loved by God, then to refuse God is to, in part, refuse man. That is why when Whittaker finally broke from communism, it was so much more than just a change in political view or a shifting of the mind's thoughts. It was something much more. It was a religious experience of the soul. When Whittaker broke from the Communist Party, it's like he regained what he sacrificed when he first entered. Whittaker wrote that every sincere break with communism is a religious experience, though the communists fail to identify its true nature, though he failed to go to the end of the experience. His break is the political expression of the perpetual need of the soul, whose first faint stirring he has felt within him, years, months, or days before he breaks. A communist breaks because he must choose at last between irreconcilable opposites: God or man, soul or mind, freedom or communism. Can you imagine that? The first half of Whittaker's life, 20 years of suppressing God, both from within and without. 20 years of suppressing the soul, that part of our being in which God speaks to and touches. 20 years of suppressing freedom, the liberty that our bodies, our minds, and our souls were created to live in. This was the world in which Whittaker was trying to make on the outside until he realized the death that it brought to himself on the inside. So it's no wonder Chambers' break from communism was a religious experience. It wasn't like he was a little bit off target from God's will, but he was really directly opposite of God's will. As he wrote in his own words, quote, "God and man, soul and mind, freedom and communism, they are irreconcilable opposites." Political ideologies like communism, socialism, fascism, capitalism, they all inherently include a theology on purpose or default. And it probably isn't overtly stated or even officially believed in. But they all have some sort of systematic belief in religion and who God is or who he is not. Which political, social, or economic ideologies that we all have to wrestle with if we are at all engaged? Which ones are more aligned with who God is? Which ideologies that we either agree with or reject, whether we know it or not, favor that part of us that make us human? Which ideologies celebrate freedom of thought, speech, and action? Which political policies extol the place of God and not man? Which ones speak to the soul and not just the mind? Which ones lead to freedom and not enslavement? Who are the leaders of these beliefs and what are their views and what are their lives like? These are the questions we need to ask ourselves. Does anything that I adhere to take away from God? Does it take away from the soul of man or from the freedom that God desires us to have? Does it diminish those or does it value those? There's a lie that I believe that we have bought into, and that is that our faith and our political / philosophical worldview are not connected. Now, they are definitely not the same thing, but they are intertwined, and one will lead the other. So either politics of the mind will guide the faith of the soul, or the faith of the soul will guide the mind. And there's a connection between political ideologies and faith, because many visions of how the world should be require faith and belief. As an example, I've always said that those who believe in this thing called abiogenesis, that's the evolutionary belief that life arose from non-living matter, That requires as much faith, if not more, than a Christian believing in a creator or someone believing in a creator. Faith and belief go way outside of the walls of churches and synagogues. So when Whittaker was on trial in the Hiss trials, it was much more than just two men with contradictory stories. Whittaker wrote that two faiths were on trial, two irreconcilable faiths, communism and freedom. The first half of Whittaker's life as a communist revealed the error of his mind taking the lead of his life. The second half of his life as a counter-revolutionist corrected that mistake by letting his faith take the lead. And I've seen this firsthand. I've recently witnessed this in a close friend of mine. And this person was a Bible-believing Christian. And while we had fellowship with each other on that level, we were very different, politically speaking. We had very different views on politics, economics, social views. And all I can say that is that within this last year, there was this sort of spiritual awakening that happened within this person. And this person wasn't drawn away from Christianity because they were already a professing Christian, but it was like the eyes of their heart was opened anew to the grace of God and the truth and hope that we find in His Word. And with this spiritual awakening, many of her long and closely held beliefs concerning society and politics completely changed. And this person was convicted of things that they had never been convicted of before. Why? Because it points out the connection between faith and politics and the soul and the mind. As socialism and communism are catching the attention of many young Americans, the story of Whittaker is more relevant now than it has been since really the end of the Cold War in the late 80s. As many young people like myself, when I say young, I'm 40 years old. So there's people who are a lot younger than myself who grew up in America in times of peace, and we had the luxury of not having to give much thought to communism or Nazism or totalitarianism or fascism. But now we are giving a lot of thought to capitalism and socialism and to communism. And just on a quick side note, one can't know what socialism is without knowing what communism is. Some might like to separate the two as being completely distinct, but they are not. They are connected. As socialism is the stage that comes before communism, as written in the Communist Manifesto. So in wrapping up, as we consider what these philosophies are, some of which might be brand new to us, may we prayerfully and humbly seek God, first and foremost. May we consider the witness and testimony of those who have gone before us. And may we take the wisdom from Whittaker's testimony and his charge that we all must choose at last between irreconcilable opposites, God or man, soul or mind, freedom or communism. I'll end with this. When President Ronald Reagan presented the Medal of Freedom to Whittaker Chambers in 1984, he said, "The witness is gone. The testimony will stand." And I am thankful for the testimony of Whittaker Chambers, and I hope that you are too. One day you and I will also be gone, and what will be your testimony? Who will know it, and will it stand? But much more important than that is whether it will testify to the greatness of God or to the greatness of man. Will your testimony touch the soul or just the mind? And will it place liberty in every sense over bondage? Let's prayerfully consider. Thanks again for listening. I hope you found this podcast to be a blessing to you. If you did, please leave a review and rating. It always puts the podcast out to more people. And if you know someone who you think would benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Word of mouth is the best way to spread a message. If you're interested in more things, go to our websites at salvationstuff.com or salvationstuff.simplecast.com. Thanks again. Appreciate you all. See you next time. Bye-bye.